Wednesday, July 12th. Oh, sorry, Clayton. I'm going to start over because we just started the recording. Good afternoon and welcome to the All In for Kansas Kids Strengthening Early Childhood in Kansas monthly webinar for Wednesday, July 12th, 2023. My name is Julia Gruss and I will be your webinar facilitator for today. I work as a research project specialist at the University of Kansas Center for Public Partnerships and Research. And I am joined today by my colleague, Clayton Gerard, who will be assisting me with Zoom logistics. He'll be keeping an eye on the chat, as well as dropping any relevant links from the PowerPoint slides into the chat as well. And I have to give a shout out to our CPPR IT man, Chris Chambers, because 10 minutes before this meeting started, my Zoom was not working at all. And he was able to remote in and get me access in 10 minutes. So thank you to Chris. All right, some quick updates before we pass it off to our presenters. In case anybody has forgotten, since January, these webinars have switched to monthly, as you can see from our 2023 webinar schedule that I've kept on this slide since January. So just want to make sure that everybody knows we're monthly. If you haven't already, please feel free to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter that goes out every Monday morning. You can do so through the Children's Cabinet website at kschildrenscabinet.org. Today's presenters are Natalie McClane of the Kansas State Department of Education and Kim Kennedy of the Kansas Department of Children and Families, who both serve as core team members on the Kansas Early Learning Standards revision team. They'll be giving us an overview of the work and revisions that their team has made to update those standards. And following their presentation, I will just have a few early childhood systems updates to give before we wrap up our meeting. But for now, Natalie and Kim, thank you so much for being here, and you can take the floor.
Good afternoon. As Julia shared, I'm Kim Kennedy. I'm the Head Start Collaboration Director with the Kansas Department for Children and Families. For the last year, Natalie McClane from Kansas Department of Education and myself have been working with a group of early childhood professionals across the state to update our state's early learning standards. This has been a coordinated effort across state agencies that serve children from birth to 5 years of age to update the Kansas early learning standards. This work centers around making sure that Kansas early learning standards are developmentally appropriate and include practices that can be widely used with professionals working with children in Kansas ages birth to kindergarten, and also to ensure that the standards that developmentally practice is at the heart of this work. The team began with a core team of early childhood education experts that were led by Natalie McClane and supported by KUCPPR. This team's work began in February of 2022. And as you see here, there is a list of the core team participants. And before beginning the work, we wanted to focus on a few focus areas in mind before we dove into the specific content areas of the standards. And these focus areas included looking at the current standards with a lens on where there may appear to be standards missing within the document. You can go back a slide, please. Sorry, thank you. And then also looking at the standards with a lens on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And lastly, we took a look at the standards with a lens on the usability of the standards for different audiences, such as families, childcare professionals, and school districts as well. So as work on these areas during our bi-monthly meetings, there were some things that we were able to flesh out. And one of those would be, first of all, in some of the areas where it would appear that there maybe were standards missing, we learned that in some situations, maybe it wasn't developmentally appropriate to have a specific standard in place. And an example of that would be in the content area of social emotional development. It would not be developmentally appropriate to expect an infant to have developed an understanding of right from wrong. And so, you wouldn't see that until, more like your pre-3 age range. And then also within that, we determined that it would be a good idea to have a graphic indicator to recognize that these skills are not developmentally appropriate at this time. And then with other standards where there appeared to be like kindergarten level, where it was available, then those were added within the document. And so a user could follow that progression up through the kindergarten age range. And then we took a more intentional statement on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we felt it was necessary that this statement be added within each of the content areas of the document and not just within the introduction of the document itself. And so that way, if there is a user who might want to go directly to a specific content area, that they will be receiving then that full message of the importance of keeping equity, inclusion, and diversity at the forefront of their planning. And then the next, we looked at developing training and guidance for each audiences that would be using the standards, as well as using plain language so that it would be the most helpful way to make sure that the updated standards are more widely used. And then lastly, the group also decided that the final online document would include what the standards would look like in practice, as well as strategies on how to help children meet standards to allow the standards themselves to be more user-friendly and help providers with appropriate practices. Next slide, please. So the early learning standards are things that we want children to know and to be able to do. And the position statement that you see here, the National Association of Education of Young Children and the National Association of Early Childhood Specialists in the State Department of Education. And it reinforces the work that we were trying to accomplish with our revisions work. And so our statement says, rather than relying on simplification of standards for older children, the content and desired outcomes of effective early learning standards are based on research about the processes, sequences, and long-term consequences of early learning and development. And so with that in mind, we were very intentional about starting, with those foundational skills and then building our way up through that progression of development to kindergarten age range. So next slide, please. And I will turn it over to Natalie.
Thanks, Kim. So we are, I'm going to just kind of fill you in on some of the changes and updates that we've been making. We are by no means finished with this project, but we want to let you know kind of where we are at right now. So in August of what year are we in? 2022. We started, our core team was ready to begin work on our content areas. So for this part of the work, we gathered content area specialists to help with each area. So these specialists included experts from the field on each of the topic areas and included childcare providers, preschool teachers, we had Head Start teachers and directors, trainers, we had 2- and 4-year college representatives, and we even had KSDE staff that specialize in each of the subject areas for K through 12, just to name a few. We held 2 virtual meetings per month. The first meeting of each month centered around a content area and involved the larger group that consisted of the core group that we showed you earlier, along with the content area specialists. So groups reviewed the current standards and worked to make edits. During the second meeting of the month, just the core team would meet to discuss suggestions from the content area specialists and to make final decisions on revisions. As the team progressed through the standards, a consistent issue we found was there were quite a few standards that were the same or they were repeated across multiple age groups. For example, in the language standards, there's a standard that said uses frequently occurring nouns and verbs. It was listed as both a pre-K and a kindergarten standard. So the team has worked to make sure standards showed up where they are actually appropriate. We did not, however, change any of the kindergarten standards as these are pulled directly from the K through 12 existing standards. Next slide, please. So in, in August, the content specialists and the core team focused on the approaches to learning standards. And the group listened to a presentation on the college and career competency framework from Patty Noonan. We made the connection between this framework and the approaches to learning standards. Very minor updates were made to these standards. We just had a few wordsmithing and simplification of some of these standards. So there were not any major changes to approaches to learning. As we go through these content area standards, I just want to point out that I've showed you just an outline of the standards as we've revised them. So you can see what we'll be working with when we eventually release the KELS. Next slide, please. In September, we worked on physical health and development. After seeing how quickly time went when we did the first content area, we decided to make a Google document of the current standards, and that sent that out beforehand, and then the team was able to make suggestions before the meetings, and then we spent the bulk of the meetings discussing those suggestions. This enabled the team to make a better use of our collaborative time. So minor changes were made in this content area. It included changing the subset that once said personal hygiene to a more early childhood appropriate self-care, and then using the terms gross and fine motor instead of large and small motor, which we see more frequently in the field. Next slide, please. So I know this one is going to look overwhelming, but as we focused on social emotional development standards, you can see here that this is the heart of our early learning standards. It has the most standards in it. We always hear from our kindergarten teachers that if us in early childhood can get those social emotional standards down, that they'll tackle the academic stuff. So I think this is really reflective of the work we do in early childhood. Changes in our social emotional development standards included removing the subsection play in a developmentally appropriate role in classroom management and school governance. That section had standards that were represented in other sections of the document, as well as some that just did not really make sense to the title of the subsection. The wording of some subsections were updated to reflect more direct language. We had some and it's still a little wordy, but some very wordy subsections titles that occasionally we would ask ourselves, professionals for a long time, what does this mean? So we updated it to be a little more clear and direct, and overall made the section more meaningful and appropriate. In February, the team decided to add community and citizenship to the social emotional development subsection on social development. So you'll see that at the very bottom. These standards were originally located in the social studies section of the standards, which has now been removed. We'll talk more about that later, but we thought these fit well here. So they're not anything new. They're just moved from a different section. Next slide, please. Communication and literacy skill development is another big content area. The communication and literacy skill development standards were the focus of the November meeting. This section was so closely aligned with K through 12 standards that a lot of it didn't make sense for early childhood. The team made the document more appropriate by putting standards in order of how young children learn. So we started with speaking and listening standards, then moved on to language, literature, foundational skills, and then writing. We combined that, what was once, there was a literature section and then informational text. We combined those into one section. Because for early childhood, most of those just repeated in each section, so it made more sense to just go ahead and combine them. The team also simplified the writing section into one section. As we know, there was not a lot of like 0 to 3 standards under writing, and it didn't make sense to have such a large section devoted to something that's not appropriate for our early childhood kiddos. Next slide, please. So mathematical knowledge was our December meeting. The content specialist discussed how it would be worthwhile to try and align standards with each age side by side visually for those standards that continue across all age group. There are quite a few standards that don't go across all age groups because, as we know, it's not always age appropriate. But for those that do go across, if we could visually align them, that would be good. There were discussions related to the flow of these standards and just some minor wordsmithing. Math didn't have a whole bunch of big changes. Next slide, please. Our January meeting is when we discussed the science standards. The group noted that the math and science standards do tend to cross over in several cases, as a lot of our early childhood learning does. A lot of things kind of cross over, but the math and science were very close. We rearranged some of the standards to group together those about weather. It seemed like the weather standards were kind of dotted throughout several of the science topics. Some of the strand names were updated to more plain language to make it out more friendly for our practitioners. We also added the section scientific inquiry, as this is the basis for not just scientific learning, but much of early childhood learning in general. Next slide, please. Does this little guy look a little bit sad by his map? It's because we got rid of social studies. He's sad. But don't be sad, because when we reviewed the social studies standards in February, we found that most of these standards were already covered in other content areas, or they just weren't developmentally appropriate. We also found that many states do not have standards for social studies. The group decided to take out those that were just inappropriate and those that were repeated from other sections. There were several related to weather that we moved to join the science standards that already had weather standards in them. And several were already existing in social emotional standards, which makes sense if you think about social studies. We're talking about some social emotional stuff, right? This left a very small group of standards that all had to do with the topic of citizenship. So this section was added to the social emotional standards under the interpersonal skills heading. We were then able to delete this section of standards. Next slide, please. Creative arts is our last content area. So in March, the group reviewed the creative arts standards. Originally, these standards were broken down into 4 subheadings. And then for each of the 4 standard headings that included physical, responding, creating, and understanding. So we would have those 4 under each of the dance, music, dramatic play, visual arts, which was a bit repetitive. These were not all developmentally appropriate, and many of the 0 to 3 standards were repeated from other sections. So the group decided to reduce the standards into one large section for each of the 4 subheadings of dance, music, dramatic play, and visual arts, and remove the standards that weren't appropriate. The other thing you'll notice is we have dramatic play now. Previously, it was, what was it? It was acting in theater. So this was more early childhood appropriate. Next slide, please. So that kind of wraps up the content areas that we have, but we certainly have more work to do. We spent a lot of time going through the introduction of the document and making sure that it led practitioners to do the things that we know is best for early childhood children. As we move forward, we would love to get some feedback from all of you. So I welcome you now to please either come off mute or share in the chat as we discuss some of the things that we need to work on as we move forward. As we begin to look at the process of putting the updates into print, I'd like to know how many of you would prefer a printed document versus looking up standards online, and if you have any comments about that. So please do come off mute or pop in the chat any comments you have about print versus an online document. So, oh, we're seeing a lot of printed, which I was not expecting. And I see both, so great. When we offer training on the KELS, it's helpful to have the printed copies to reference. Printed helps with lesson planning. Both options are good, 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 good. This is all really helpful. Keep them coming. Online is easier to search. Great, great. Okay. So when we begin our dissemination process of getting these out to everyone, how can we best get this information to you and the people that you work with? So where do you usually go for information and resources like this? When you look for, and okay, so we have the KSDE website, resource and referral pages, KSDE website, ECE Resources Kansas, Casino, your USD that you work with, great. KSDE, all right. Keep those coming. My next question that I would love to have some feedback on is when we think about training, how do you prefer to receive your training on the updated standards? Would you prefer that it be an in-person event? Do you prefer just virtual, a pre-recorded training? Do you have other ideas on how you would like to get this information? Webinars, both, virtual. Thank you guys for interacting. This makes it really helpful. Options for both, great. Not pre-recorded. Okay. So we're hoping that we've made this document really useful for families as well. I know occasionally I'll get a call from a family who's maybe they've got their kiddos at home with them and they're asking what could they be working on with their children at home, or what would they be working on if they were in a preschool program. Do you think a training for families would be well received? Is this something that you think families would use, a training? We got a maybe. Some families would, if they were made aware. Okay. We will also be doing some work around where to house the standards and the toolbox to go with it online. What are some resources that you think would be helpful to go along with the updated standards? Are there any tools that you think would be? I know in the past, when I was in a Head Start program, I would dissect and make my own resources to go along with the KELS. Are there some that you're making that would be easier if we made them for you? A list of skill activities and play items needed. NAYC. Lesson planning forms. Oh, that's not something that we'd thought of. Okay. Kim, do you have any other questions that you want to add to these?
I do not. I'm just going back and rereading a lot of the comments too.
Yes, we're
that
getting a lot of.
everybody so generously provided in the chat. This is really helpful information. We really appreciate your input.
So I do see several people have asked for me to reach out to them, and I'm happy to do that. Next slide, please. I just would like to know what other questions or comments that you all have on the updates. Does anyone have any questions that we can try and answer for you? Time frame. Oh, that was the question I was fearing. We are hoping to have these by the end of, we are hoping to print them by the end of, I lost my timeline. (2024), I believe. (2024), so early. I'm not going to say early. I want to say 2024. It's going to be a little while still. We still have a lot of work to do. The printing process alone takes some time. Do you suggest we continue to provide KELS training until it's complete? I do. It's still going to be some time before these are out. Am I missing any other questions? An easy to read chart with standards with the age category. Other questions? Next slide, please. So here are the contacts for Kim and I as we continue this work. If there is any, if you have any questions or comments about the KELS, please do feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to help as we can. If there are no questions, I thank you all for your time. And please do reach out if you have any questions. I'm going to try and reach out to this. I think I have most of these people on my radar to reach out to you if you ask to get together and discuss something. So thank you all for your time today. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Natalie and Kim. We appreciate all of the ongoing work that you all have done, as well as the rest of the core team and the content area specialists on updating those early learning standards and for filling us in on your process. And I'm glad you got some good feedback today as well. All right, moving on to some of our early childhood systems updates. I will probably be able to give everyone some time back today as I only have a few, but starting with the Child Care Capacity Accelerator. Through the Child Care Capacity Accelerator, the Kansas Children's Cabinet and Trust Fund was able to approve over $43.5 million in grant funding that was awarded to 52 Kansas organizations and partnerships. As you can see from the map on your screen, they worked very hard to spread that funding throughout the entire state. The accelerator will support community-based teams, including early childhood providers and champions, employers, and economic development leaders in their efforts to create affordable and accessible childcare seats within their communities. Thank you so much to all of the applicants and to the entire team that worked to make this happen. This is most definitely a victory for childcare in Kansas. Child Care Aware of Kansas is now offering the 2023 Legacy Scholarship, created in honor of Liddell Ediger, who is the Executive Director of Child Care Aware of Kansas. It awards up to $1,700 towards an early childhood certificate at a Kansas community college. Grants will be awarded to licensed family child care providers or child care center employees that work directly with children for at least 30 hours per week. You can view more information as well as apply for this scholarship at the Child Care Aware of Kansas website. That Clayton will be putting that link into the chat for you. And all of those applications will be due by Friday, July 21st. More good news and productive research from the Kansas Children's Cabinet. In the fall of 2022, the University of Kansas Center for Public Partnerships and Research conducted a survey to learn how Kansans understood topics surrounding early childhood developmental health. There were nearly 1,500 families and providers across the state that participated in this survey. Some of the solutions that came from these sessions included featuring developmental health in community family engagement opportunities, increasing home-based supports, ensuring developmental health information is available through a centralized resource hub, elevating family voice, and increasing community awareness of developmental health screenings and resources for families through local partners. You can learn much more about the survey and the solutions on the Cabinet's Community Spotlight page. And if you're interested in implementing any of the ideas developed through these sessions, you can contact Rachel Gardner at CPPR. Her email is on the screen, rachelgardner@ku.edu. And some additional general updates on upcoming conferences. Hotel workers in Anaheim, California are currently on strike. The workers who belong to Unite Here Local 11 are largely women of color and immigrant women, with many working 2 or 3 jobs to support their families, most of which cannot afford to live in the communities in which they work. They are asking for higher pay, fair treatment, housing, and respect. Therefore, the Build 2023 conference coordinators have decided to postpone the conference in order to support the efforts to secure fair pay and create a better work environment for those that are on strike. They will instead be holding a virtual conference in mid-November, as well as an in-person conference in late November. And no worries if you had already been registered for the original conference, that registration now covers participation in either or both of these options. In early childhood resource news, the career pathway for Kansas childcare professionals is making advancement more equitable and attainable by bringing together existing system offerings while offering multiple entry points. It's used to illustrate the variety of professional learning opportunities and supports that make it easier to plan a fulfilling career in childcare. Feel free to use the link in the chat to explore the career pathway even further. And in professional development opportunities, the Kansas Children's Service League continues to offer several trainings for child abuse prevention, trauma-informed care, and more, which also qualify for your childcare licensing hours. You can register for these sessions at the KCSL website. That link will also be placed in the chat. And another conference update, the KCSL 47th Annual Governors Conference for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect will happen in person from October 18th through the 20th at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Wichita, Kansas. Registration for this conference will be open in August. Reminders and next steps for our next upcoming meetings. We have the Early Childhood Recommendations Panel meeting being held next Friday on July 21st from 9 to 11:30 a.m. These meetings are always live streamed on the Children's Cabinet YouTube channel. The Children's Cabinet meeting will be held on Friday, August 4th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. And our next Early Childhood Systems Building webinar will be on Wednesday, August 9th from 12 to 1. You can find all of these meetings and more on the Children's Cabinet YouTube channel. Thank you so much. And as always, to stay up to date with the Children's Cabinet, you can sign up for that All In for Kansas Kids e-newsletter. You can follow us on Twitter, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. So thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon, and we will see you all again in August.